Hi, I'm Spiders, and I'm currently top 100 in the world with Purple Cloud. As a top player, here's everything you need to know in order to use and counter the Purple Cloud effectively. Let's get into it. The first thing I'd like to talk about with this weapon before we get into using it in combat is your build. I primarily advise using the Purple Cloud with builds that take advantage of overall benefiting a lot from having a powerful weapon, or builds that have synergy with the weapon's crit. Some examples of builds are Silent or Tombless for builds that benefit most from generally having strong weapons, or builds that can take advantage of its strong guard break crit, such as a Gale or Ice build. Besides your base build, if you plan on using this weapon, a question that you will likely run into is what enchant you should use. For that, I'd say any of the meta enchants right now will work well, such as Blazing, Solar Defer, depending on your build, etc. Tears of Edenkai is also a pretty good choice in this weapon, but not as good as before after the cooldown nerf Purple Cloud just received on its crit. The last important point for your build that I'll mention is that since you're forced to use one-handed stance with this weapon, you should be running a sidearm. For that, I highly recommend you go with the Parrying Dagger. Since Silver 6 lost its bullet, Sight Gun is pretty much out of the picture, unless you want to invest in the light, which since you already have to invest a lot of points into your weapon is probably not worth it. I also would advise against shield, since shields reduce the amount of posture you gain back on parry, which is bad because this weapon already kind of struggles with posture issues, which I'll get more into later. But overall, Parrying Dagger or Kyrsteer is likely your best bet here for the free extra posture regen on parry. Now that that's out of the way, I'll now move on to how to use the weapon effectively in a fight. The actual M1s for this weapon aren't really anything special. They're sort of just a slower version of Just Creator that has no chip, so I won't really be focusing too much on that aspect. I will say it's sort of in the middle between being a really slow light weapon or a really fast medium weapon, so take that as you may. Now where this weapon is unique, as I'm sure many of you will have realized by now, is the crit. This weapon has a very powerful ranged guard break crit, which isn't like any other crit in the game at this point. What really makes this effect strong is that it's basically the same as having a roll catcher and a guard break built into one. Something you might notice in a lot of these clips is that I'm catching my opponent with crits after I've exhausted all of their defensive options by playing very aggressively. Normally with other guard breaks like the Neve crit, Sacred Hammer crit, or even monsters like Champion's Roll Through or Thunder Kick, it wouldn't be possible to catch people like this and guard break them. However, with this weapon's range it is possible, and that's what makes this weapon special. That core ability of being able to guard break and being a roll catcher at the same time is really what makes this a unique legendary weapon, so if you plan on using this weapon at a high level, make sure you keep this in mind. Besides that, this is a guard break crit, so I'll quickly go over some general tips that apply to guard break crits. Guard break crits are pretty effective during lots of forms of stun. For example, you'll see me using it a lot during reverse Gale Kick. This is a pretty good use case since lots of common forms of stun will prevent your opponent from being able to roll, so if they waste their parry, your guard break is guaranteed to hit block, which of course you'll punish your opponent for, since this is a guard break we're talking about. Guard breaks are also okay for mix-ups and parry trades, however I wouldn't really say so much on this weapon, since its crit is a little too slow to catch good players off guard and parry trades. And last thing, if you are able to notice patterns in your opponent's gameplay where you can punish them for their block, this crit can be effective in those situations, so if you want to use this crit to its fullest potential, always be paying attention to your opponent's actions, so that you can read them as well as possible. Now what I'm sure a lot of you have been waiting for is how to counter this weapon, and really the core weaknesses this weapon has so that you can beat people who are using it. The first weakness I like to mention, and one that you'll probably notice if you're switching from another medium weapon on a comp build, is that posture management is really difficult on this weapon. Since you're forced to use this weapon one-handed as mentioned earlier, you aren't able to use the Stronghold talent, which really sucks since the 20% reduced posture damage taken is very noticeable, especially against the current meta of posture abuse builds. Also, the crit further extrapolates this weakness for a couple of reasons. First, if your opponent parries the crit, it loads up your posture super high. After your crit is parried, your opponent can easily punish you with some high posture damage moves, like M1 Fate into Strong Left, which, since you also don't have the 20% reduced posture damage received from Stronghold, can be very punishing. Also, since the crit is a fairly long cooldown and also a pretty long windup, it can be difficult to land the crit consistently in order to proc critical attack, which is a talent that's pretty important for reducing your posture as well. These reasons add up together to make the weapon have a pretty impactful posture weakness. So pretty much if you're fighting the Purple Cloud, try to see what high posture damage moves you have in your kit, and if you ever parry the crit, you can abuse those moves to punish your opponent pretty hard. Besides that, be sure to conserve your defensive options against this weapon. Really, when every build has 2 dodges and a parry to counter this crit, if you're wasting all these evasive options and being hit by the crit, you're probably going wrong somewhere in defense. This crit has a pretty long windup, so as long as you're conserving your parry and dodges properly, you shouldn't have much issue dealing with this weapon's crit. Besides the crit, if you're struggling with the base weapon itself, then that's a separate issue to be solved. You sort of have to treat this weapon like Just Creator, since both weapons have a high swing speed, hard to read animations, and even for whatever reason, the same running attack. This isn't a super good thing, since Just Creator is already acknowledged by a lot of people to be pretty frustrating to fight, but there's not really much you can do about that. So, just like when fighting Just Creator, prediction parry the weapon if you need to, but try to avoid it if possible. And be careful of overly parry trading this weapon, especially if your opponent has a build optimized for parry trading, since this weapon is pretty strong in that aspect too. Also, last small note, if you really want to counter people who use this weapon, you can also use the Authority Commander armor, since it gives you 10% additional blunt armor to the innate 30% physical armor this weapon has, for a total of 40% blunt armor, which since this weapon is a blunt weapon, can give you a slight edge against Purple Cloud users. So the Authority Commander is a pretty good armor in this meta, including against the Purple Cloud. That's pretty much all the important info you need to know regarding this weapon in PvP. Let me know if you think this weapon needs a nerf or if you plan on using it. Like and subscribe for more top PvP content, and see you in the next one.